right, next we have Alex talking about validation actions.
Hello. Let's see, does this work? Yeah, so hi, I'm Alex Shumesky. I work mostly on the Android rules, but sometimes I dabble in other parts of Bazel. So what I'm going to talk about today are validation actions. So firstly, what is a validation action? Sometimes you want to do things in a build that really don't produce any outputs necessarily. So you could think of things like linting or static analysis on files. And you can't really do this in Starlark because you don't have access to these files at analysis time. So you have to run these in the execution phase, which means actions. Now, ideally, you would not be increasing the build times with these actions because, again, they don't produce any outputs. So they wouldn't be used further on into the build. A good example of this might be Android Lint. So this is a tool that we run internally on a lot of our code, mostly our Android app code, but also just our regular Java code. And this does a lot more than just like checking style and things like that. It actually checks the code for bugs, common error patterns that you might use in code. And importantly, Android Lint can actually take longer to run than compiling those same sources. It runs, hundreds of checks, and as you add more checks, it could take more and more time. It can produce a file for reading what the errors are, but this is not something that's used in the rest of the build. So this might, you might now wonder, if an action doesn't produce any files, how do you actually get Bazel to run that action? Let's see. So historically, we have two kinds of workarounds that you could try to do to get a validation style action to run. What you might do is trick Bazel. You can have a dummy validate. You can have a validation action output at some dummy output. In fact, you might even have to wrap your action in like a shell script to produce an empty file, and then add that dummy output to the input of some other action in your build graph. And you can kind of imagine how bad that might be for the critical path because you're artificially adding an action before some other action. Now, another kind of workaround is a little more clever. You might add a third action, and your main action's output goes into that artificial third action, and the validation action's output goes into that artificial third action. And all this action does is copy the real output to some other file, just to trick Bazel into running your validation action, something like Android Lint or static analysis. And you can kind of see here how Bazel thinks that it needs to run the validation action before the copy action, but you're just tricking Bazel into running it. And so there are a lot of downsides to these kind of workarounds. It's inefficient, of course, because you're copying things you don't need to copy, really. More actions or more memory. It's confusing. You're reading your code, and why do you have these additional actions? You have more artifacts to think about, more code to think about, and it's brittle. As your code evolves, you have to remember these additional actions. So with all these drawbacks, we added a little bit better support for this class of action. Basically, a validation action is just like any other action, but you take its output, which again might be a dummy output that you add in. You add this output to a special validations output group. And real briefly, what an output group is it's sort of the set of all artifacts that you're requesting at the top level for Bazel to build. And there's the default output group, which you are asking for when you do Bazel build. So we added this special validations output group, which is always requested. So you're always building all of the artifacts in this output group. And importantly, all of the artifacts are collected automatically throughout your build that go into the validations output group. And what you can also do is run these validation actions even after your build is completed, because again, these aren't needed for your build. So when you're doing something like Bazel test, you could even run these validation actions concurrently with the test after all the regular actions have run. So here you can kind of see how this looks. So you'll have lots of regular main actions, validation actions, and their dummy outputs go in the validation output group, and the real outputs go into your regular output groups. And it's kind of pulling all the validation actions to the top of the action graph so they can be run at any time. So our experience with Android Lint internally, again, this is an action that typically takes longer to run than Java C or Kotlin C. And we don't really ever see this in the critical paths internally. The rest of the build pretty much acts as it does usually. So there are some limitations with this. One thing we observed internally is because Bazel wants to err on the side of caution with running validation actions, as you saw in the previous slide where you had the two output groups, all the validation actions are always going to be run if you touch any target that has a validation action in it, even if you don't actually use anything from that target. So we have a certain class of rules which will just look at the analysis time information for a build. It's just collecting like providers and looking at their information. It doesn't actually use any artifacts from that build. But the validation actions still run. Bazel, again, wants to err on the side of caution and validate everything in your build. And so you're still running actions even if you're just using information from providers and none of the actual artifacts. And this also means that any inputs to validation actions are also built, like anything on the, if the validation action needs class path information, that means you're potentially building all the jars that go into that validation action. So over triggering is one problem that we've seen. And another limitation is that you can only be as parallel as your resources allow. So, if you have 1,000 targets that you want to build and each of those has a validation action, well, that means you need to run on 1,000 additional actions. You may not have 1,000 machines all running in parallel to run all of those actions, all at once. So potential improvements we could have here. The validation output group is a little bit of a clunky API. You put a dummy artifact in this magic output group, and then suddenly it's a validation action. So improving the API to mark actions as actual validation actions would be nice. And providing better controls over the over-triggering problem I just mentioned. Perhaps some way, for example, to control when validation actions run in a more granular level, or enabling Bazel to run validation actions only when something within that target is actually used. This is documented. So if you go to the Bazel website and go to extending and then rules, there's a section that summarizes all of this with a little example. And that's all I have about validation actions. I may have time for a question or two. I'm not sure. Yeah, one question. Anyone have one question? Go ahead. I think you're the only one.
I'll just talk about it.
Yeah. Or I'll repeat the question.
That dummy output group.
Yeah.
Is it possible to generate, say, like patch files so you could then take and apply like a file?
Oh yeah.
Like apply after the build or something?
Yeah, actually, yeah, you could absolutely do that. What's that? Oh, sorry. Yes, you can do that thing that he said. So the question was, let's say you had like Clang format, and Clang format would output a patch file or a diff, which could you then collect all of those files and then use that to just change, just update all of your code. And yes, you could do that. Because output groups, like that's kind of exactly what they're designed for. You're saying, Bazel, give me all of these files, and then you just have those files. I think there might be a way to actually query what the files actually are. You may have to experiment, see if that's actually true. All right, I have 1 minute apparently for another question, if anyone has another question. Yes.
Actually, I have one question. So This can also be achieved by an aspect rule, right? So
Yes.
what's the benefit or between using a validation action or an aspect rule?
Excellent question. In fact, that experimental flag that I showed, which enables you to run validation actions in parallel with tests, actually is implemented as an aspect, I think. Yeah, so it's totally the same how you could implement that. One reason we wanted to implement this slightly new feature is so that you didn't have to have the overhead of an aspect, because aspects increase memory a little bit. You're creating a new node in SkyGraph and so forth. Whereas with a validation action output group, that's an existing mechanism. Output groups have been around in Bazel for a very, very long time. So we wanted to leverage existing mechanisms and not have to have the overhead of remembering, having to add an aspect, having to have the additional memory cost, a little bit of additional analysis time too to actually run the aspect. And now I'm over time. Okay, thank you. Thank you, everyone.